I have been acting somewhat contrary lately towards Father Schumacher. That's probably my Lenten challenge, is not to do that anymore. He makes it easy because ever since he arrived on July the 1st, I've been able to say to him, our children didn't have to wear masks in school until you got here. We had full masses at Ash Wednesday and Christmas, until you got here. It's been a delightful opportunity to rub them a little bit, but perhaps for Lent I need to be a little more careful about that, because what's the opposite of that sort of contrariness? Instead of being always tempted to give in to that, maybe I need to look at what's the other side of that, and that would be, of course, charity towards him. I thought of that because of the gospel today, with the temptation of Jesus in the desert, and wondered what would people say is the opposite of temptation? Because that is the temptation for preachers, to preach about temptation here on this first Sunday of Lent, where the gospel is about the temptation of Christ. But what's contrary to that? And I think we see it played out in the readings, of course. We see it in the first reading with Noah. Tempted by the culture has collapsed in on itself. They're all about their own gratification and self-satisfaction. But Noah seeks to follow God's will. And so he is called upon to save his family and build the ark, as a symbol of contrariness to the temptation of the culture. It is to do God's will. We see that in the gospel. Jesus is tempted, yes, but what's to be recognized is his determination to follow his Father's will. His whole life is about that. His very existence in humanity began with the Blessed Mother's fiat, her willingness to say, let it be done according to your will. We see his redemptive act of the crucifixion set in place in the garden when he says, not my will, but your will be done. He incorporates it into the greatest prayer given to us by himself in the Our Father. Thy will be done. It's a reminder to us that the opposite of temptation is a willingness to accept God's will, to follow the Lord's will in our life. Thy will be done. Not mine, but God's will in my life. That's our Lenten encouragement and call. To ask, how do I allow God's will to be accomplished in my life, even when I'm feeling tempted, even when I feel those urgings away from the will of God, to instead let God's will be accomplished in my life, and allow that to be my focus. St. Peter in the second reading urges us that by our baptism we have been given a particular tool to achieve that, in prayer. That baptism, which the flood prefigured, is not the removal of dirt from the body, but an appeal to God for a clear conscience. Our calling as members of Christ's body by our baptism is a calling to appeal to God, to pray to God, to recognize that this relationship that has been established with us from the beginning of time, in which God first created humanity, and which he oft reminds Noah of after the flood, is that we are in a relationship with the Lord that seeks to be a relationship of love, and that we have what we need to appeal to God. to allow His will to be done in our life. Each of us in this Lenten season are called to ask, how is God's will being accomplished in my life? Appropriate to our vocation, how is God's will being accomplished in our life? Our celebration of the rite of election is a reminder that as a whole church, while recognizing those who wish to become members of the faith, we are supporting them with our prayer, with our appeal to God, that they be supported, encouraged, and nurtured in their journey towards our faith community, in their journey towards God. That as they pray God's will may be done in their lives, so we join them in that prayer as one community of faith, united in this mystery of God's love that was poured out for us from the cross and continues to be celebrated at this altar. God's gift of love, in which Christ prayed God's will be done. As we continue with our Lenten celebrations, as we celebrate today the rite of election, let us pray always and in every moment of our day, God's will be done.